Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to this evening's edition of ILF Samanvay. ILF Samanvay, India Habitat Centre's Indian Languages Festival, was begun in 2011 to provide a platform to interlink, connect, and converge the diversities and genius of Indian languages. We are extremely privileged to have Dr. Gayatri Spivak for this evening's lecture. Please welcome Dr. Spivak. I will not waste precious time saying the customary few words about Dr. Spivak, for they would be entirely superfluous. Her formidable stature and following is evident from the deluge of excited registrations and the disappointment bordering on despair for those who were too late to be accommodated. I will take a minute, however, to thank on behalf of ILF Samanvay, Naveen Kishore, owner and publisher of Seagull Books, and our partner for this year's translation series. He has brought on board some of the most amazing minds through the year, and this evening and tomorrow's distinguished speakers are entirely thanks to this unassuming, incredible man. Thank you, Naveen, and may I now call you to come forward and take this evening. To come and take the, there.
Hi, welcome everybody. I don't know about the incredible bit, but your mic's coming up. Yeah, I'll just finish this and you can. Okay, so by way of introduction, I have a little text which is entitled Naveen on Gayatri Day. I must tell you about the light, the one that hangs above the lake, suspended, inches above the water, the silver of the water surface, reflecting. Gayatri Day to Naveen. For me, the future is a vanishing present, and its joy is that one can work for it, yet cannot know it. It is the contingent as such, even the immediate future. Now that death is near, the necessary claims the place for the contingent. Perhaps it is the other way. I'm on a train and it's getting late. The question of translation will have to wait till February. To your question about resisting the present, I offer a distracted answer. I am out of joint with most of the present. I am addicted to engaging with it, trying to be useful, trying to change desires, a permanent persuader. A crazy life, but I'm happy. Naveen. You are indeed a permanent persuader, and you cannot imagine getting off the train, no matter how late it is, the train, I mean, and not the hour. You're also aware, even though you may refuse to admit it, that you have secretly strewn enough breadcrumbs along the way to keep the birds of prey busy while you, nimble of mind, fool death into believing it is immortal. Don't get me wrong, I simply mean that what you leave behind is not just a fine legacy, though I'm sure it is that too. What you leave behind is in fact the immediate future, beyond the stilledness of your own journey. Others will find their ways even to resist. If so, then you will have succeeded in as much as one can under the circumstances. And that is enough, maybe. Thank you, Gayatri.
Thank you, Naveen. That, in fact, I will take up a part of that conversation in my paper as well, which shows how well we work together. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is God knows how many times I have worked for Naveen, and this is not the last time either. But I'm really tremendously delighted that Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whom I can't see, Ngugi, you are there, right? I can see you. Well, that's not enough, sweetie. But and the last time, there you are. The last time that I was in his audience was in New York City, remember? the Revolution bookstore. So it's completely appropriate that he should be in my audience now. And Romila Thapar is here too, I think. Are you, Romila? If you are, I'm a little terrified of these two people who are very, very old friends, but I'm also delighted and honored that they're in my audience. My title actually is just Necessary Yet Impossible, question mark. Okay. Some years ago, I described the necessity of translation, see, necessary and impossible. Did I really say yet? It's and, I think, necessary and impossible. Some years ago, I described the necessity of translation as follows. There is actually a more complex description for those who are interested, which can be found in the journal Parallax. Here it is. There is a language we learn first, mixed with the pre-phenomenal, in other words, before we appear, as a collection of changeful forms of appearance, which stamps the meta-psychological, in other words, that which is not available to our psychology or mental movements, circuits of lingual memory, in other words, abstract, activable memory as in a computer, within the history of the language. In other words, before the generating of a personal memory. Let me read the sentence again. There is a language we learn first, mixed with the pre-phenomenal, which stamps the metapsychological circuits of lingual memory. The child invents a language, beginning by bestowing signification upon a part object, bottle, breast, finger. The parents learn this language. Because they themselves speak a named language, the child's language gets inserted into the named language, which has a history before the child's birth, will continue to produce a history after the child's death. As the child begins to navigate this language, it is beginning to access the entire interior network of the language, all its possibility of articulations, for which the best metaphor that can be found, especially in the age of computers, is memory. By comparison, cultural memory is a crude concept of narrative rememorization that attempts to privatize the historical record. All languages are originary in this special way and establishes the reflexivity of language as habit, which some 20th century theorists of language, I'm thinking of Benveniste, some 20th century theorists of language think of as transcendental. Here, the child is translating no locatable content, but the very moves of languaging. This is not to make an opposition between the natural spontaneity of the emergence of my languaged place and the artificial effortfulness of learning foreign languages. Rather, it is to emphasize the metapsychological and telecommunicative nature of the subjects being encountered. I mean, this whole business of the child learning a named language with the help of adults around it is the child being encountered by languaging. So the metapsychological and telecommunicative nature of the subjects being encountered by the languaging of place. If we entertain the spontaneous artificial opposition, I'm spontaneous, everything else is artificial, we will possibly value our own place over all others and thus defeat the ethical impulse, a sense of equivalence among languages, rather than a comparison of historical civilizational content, which comes after. Etienne Balibar has suggested that equivalence blurs difference, whereas equality requires them, precisely because civil war may be the allegoric name for an extreme form of the failure of translation. It is that blurring that we need when we think the pre-phenomenal, metapsychological translation of languaging as the condition of possibility of the human. It is necessary for us to keep the pran boititro, the biological diversity of the outside of the human, outside of this. Melanie Klein, the literalist Jewish daughter of a Basque father, thought of the uterine as an original when we are in the womb, and the violence of birth as a death into what we now know as the Anthropocene. Lacan describes the pre-subjective drive falling upon, and I quote in the English translation, the anatomical trace of a margin or border. Every word here is full of meaning. Before the subject, the drives in the machine of the body are beginning to articulate the body, give it a shape. In Bengali and I suppose also Sanskrit, we would call this a kaya sthiti, not being a grihastha, which comes later, but being a kayastha. You placed in your body with borders and holes. So Lacan describes the pre-subjective drive falling upon the anatomical trace of a margin or borders. Every word here is full of meaning. Lips, enclosure of the teeth, rim of the anus, penile fissure, vagina, fissure of eyelid, indeed hollow of the ear. Respiratory erogeneity comes into play through spasms. In other words, border thinking is an undecided and primary constituent of our perception of reality itself, where reason is fashioned out of what precedes it. It is of no interest to me if this account is correct, and therefore an instrument of cure. The literary reader learns from the singular and the unverifiable. This is a very dangerous skill and generally suspect for people who believe that the unverifiable is dangerous. The literary critic learns from the singular and the unverifiable. Lacan's imagining of the contaminating relationship between the unspeculable work of the drives, where the body is not very much more than that machine programmed, unspeculable work of the drives, unspeculable because you cannot produce its reflection, since the capital I or the subject has not been started yet, pre-phenomenal, metapsychological, and then the normative deviation of fantasy takes us forward into the contrary emergence of a, quote, real. Lacan writes, I do not wish to write about perversions. I would rather deal with fantasy. The normative deviation of fantasy, in other words, you make a mistake in order that you can go forward. Those of us who are so-called activists know very, very well how this works, but Lacan is, of course, not talking about life yet, but the beginning. The normative deviation of fantasy sets the norm by mistakenly establishing the unspeculable as specular. It's programmed to make this mistake so that we can happen. The normative deviation of fantasy sets the norm by mistakenly establishing the unspeculable as specular, and the result of that speculation as a repetition of the same. It is the realm of desire, a necessary translation into the, quote, real, an origin without guarantees. Lacan's famous sentence, the dog goes meow and the cat goes woof woof. Here's Lacan, but the synchronic structure is more hidden, and it is this that carries us to the origin. It is metaphor, insofar as the first attribution constitutes itself in it, that promulgates that sentence, the dog goes meow, the cat goes woof woof, by which, in one fell swoop, the child, by disconnecting the thing from its cry, raises the sign to the function of the signifier and reality to the sophistics of signification, and by way of a contempt for verisimilitude, opens the diversity of objectifications to verify of the same thing. I read such passages as poetic intuitions about translation at the origin, where the relationship with a presumed original is a necessary normative deviation without guarantees. An easy way of looking at this is, of course, adrishta. But I'm not going to go there because I don't like identitarianist fantasies where I'm not trained. This then is my point. 1, translation is necessary. Ourselves emerging into translating whatever is before into the real. For my point 2, the impossibility of translation, I will refer back. And you know, I did this before Naveen told me he was going to introduce me in that way. We do resonate a lot. For my point 2, the impossibility of translation, I will refer back to the written exchange between Naveen Kishore and myself, from which Naveen quoted. I woke up this morning, he wrote, leaning slightly towards the italicization of my way of being, aslant. This is him. At tangents to the world, I'm increasingly finding hard to decipher. For me, I responded, aslant is the queer as such, not derived from the straight, which is the most powerful grounding error. The straight is useful, a grounding error, the normative deviation with which we can go forward. The straight is useful, but fragile. It keeps everything else at bay. This is me writing to Naveen. The angle of slant is called imagination. It is a separator, I wrote, as much as a bringer together, as in the German Einbildungskraft. I was on the Shuri Express, an evening train, taking me back to Calcutta from my 5 village schools after a week of a deeply instructive but punishing work, and therefore my references here are to the folks in those villages I had just left behind. So I wrote, I will not, for example, on that moving train writing to Naveen, I wrote, I will not, for example, be able to touch my obviously heterogeneous, but still not, students, teachers, co-workers, supervisors, companions, women, yes, a separate category, obviously heterogeneous, but still not, unacknowledgeable LGBTQs, heterogeneous, but abbreviatable in a set of Latin alphabet capitals, until I know what word or words takes or take the slant for them. I know the gentlemanly or bhadraloki words. In this context, I slightly prefer Tagore's Kothao Amar Hariye Jabar Nei Mana Mone Mone. Bad translation, there's no problem with me getting lost anywhere in my mind. He said, in my mind, I'm going to Carolina. That's what it is. In this context, I slightly prefer Tagore's Kothao Amar Hariye Jabar Nei Mana Mone Mone to D.L. Roy's Kalpana Kobi Kathan, both class continuous with the English word carrying the romantic load. Mourn, the reason why I like Tagore here more. Mone Mone, mourn, cognate with mind and even with the anthropological mana, can slip downward. I have often quoted my illiterate friend Nimai Lohar, Mon kore udibar tare bidhi day na pakha, that's his song, Jumur. Mon kore udibar tare bidhi day na pakha. Mind makes as if to fly, fate or law, bidhi, gives no wings. In Berlin, I compared bidhi to Cordelia's bond. Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, nor more nor less. And then Lear, how, Cordelia, mend your speech a little, lest it may mar your fortunes. That's it, bond, vidhi. Mon kore udibar tare, vidhi daina pakha. The impossibility of the flight into translating the untranslatable. Vidhi or bond, wanting to, but not getting there. So, caught in the double bind between a necessity of being in translation, underived from anything but the effect of an original, before the coming together of the subject, the gendered space before our propering or appropriation into phenomenality, we decide anyway, break the double bind, claim agency through some kind of institutional validation. The oldest validating institution all the world over, before all other socialization kicks in, is reproductive heteronormativity. I will not touch upon it here for lack of time. Since we are here, readers, writers, teachers, and that rare phenomenon, an independent publisher facilitating teaching and writing, I will place a claim to the agency to translate, within the authority to publish, without entering the space of the, quote, original. I want to repeat that. I will place and read a claim to the agency to translate, within the authority to publish, without entering the space of the, quote, original. Translation as task, then. So there's necessity, impossibility, task. The third one is a little different. The first two are events. This one is task. Translation as task, then. My example is Gramsci. You want to show the first four things. Now, you know, of course, that Gramsci was told, that the prosecutor said that supposedly that this mind should not be allowed to think for the next 20 years in 1926, when illegally he was dragged into prison, political prison, narrow bed, a terrifying little room. And of course, Gramsci was himself very sick with spinal tuberculosis, but nothing, no matter, illegally he was dragged there because the prosecutor said this mind must not be allowed to think for the next 20 years. He defeated the prosecutor. Not only did he think, but he wrote, you know, that's the first page of the notebook, and there's Gramsci's handwriting. He wrote 29 books, little cardboard books in small writing, from which we are still learning, he thought. And book 25, the whole book is about the subaltern. You would never know this from the authorized and terrible English translation, from which both Edward Said and Ranajit Guha and all the subalternists read Gramsci. And I'm going to go page by page, as it were, to show how the entire effort at trying to understand, starting from slavery, the book 25 actually begins with slavery and goes through the history into what Gramsci calls small groups on the fringes of history, which the English translation group, the word is translated as class, so that immediately, right at one go, the entire effort that Gramsci is going towards, Gramsci, who was the chairman of the Communist Party, knew a good deal about classes, but he's confronting something which cannot be grasped by that. He was writing something before he was dragged to jail in 1926, which is completely different from the way in which he writes in his notebook. How can one think or catch those small groups? You would not get this from the terrible translation of Quentin Hoare and Geoffrey Noel Smith in the selections from the prison notebooks. And this is the Italian translation. The whole book is in the margins of history, the history of social, subaltern social groups. No class. Okay, next. Now there's Gramsci with his spinal tuberculosis, in pain, dying, sometimes his urine caught, bleeding in that narrow bed, but still writing. And there's the Italian translation. In the English translation, they begin from the ruling class, which comes much later in his notebooks. Gramsci's first little fragment on the subaltern is 2, item 2. This ruling class crap that they bring in from later to begin the section is item 5. So that this is immediately giving over the subaltern, God knows why, to the ruling classes. So you see here, first of all, this notes on Italian history. That is not Gramsci either. What made them deal with it this way? You ask yourselves. So, as I say, this is claiming the right to translate without any consideration of the original. Since I'm with readers, writers, and a wonderful publisher who actually gives us authority, I thought that this would be appropriate to show you what happens when, forget the necessity and the impossibility, which deal with the way we are, but then look at how within that double bind we claim tasks and how such a task can be completely ignored. So the history of the subaltern methodological criteria. Let me tell you something about methodological criteria. The methodological criteria in section 5 of the Italian in the notebook are supposed to be that which is imposed upon us because history is ruling class. It's kind of an imagining of a different kind of history, not just events and kings, which we will hear of later. We know of those movements. I'm sure there are students of history here, and I know there are historians here, who know very much, very well how that worked. But here Gramsci is trying to think of that. So the methodological criteria are, in fact, the way in which the business of the ruling class control of history has imposed a certain a set of criteria upon us. But the methodic criteria, and that phrase is nowhere in the translation. That's where, in the subaltern section, Gramsci is saying, it's like the ontico-ontological, methodico-methodological, epistemico-epistemological, that we have to think about that which is not accessible through the laying down of method in order to think these groups on the fringes of history. That is nowhere here. That particular phrase has fallen off, and the methodological criteria have been given to the ruling class. So as it is, let's go to the next. Now you see that imp over there, page 54, top of that? The top, right above the footnote. That is where the subaltern note in Gramsci begins. Why did these characters, these translators, without giving any sense of the critical apparatus, put that in the middle of the entry? I have no idea. First of all, of course, they don't tell us that Gramsci is moving slowly through a consideration of slavery and so on into the consideration of the subaltern today as something that is outside of the mode of production narrative, which he knows very well. But he actually begins the thing long before all that ruling class stuff, and somehow Quentin, I mean, this is deliberate. Somehow Quentin Hoare and Jeffrey Noel Smith, without giving a footnote that they have shifted all this stuff, put it right in the middle, and it's almost as if, you see that word fragmented there, it's almost as if they're acting out the fragmentation of any consideration of the subaltern by putting that huge footnote that cuts the sentence in half. Certainly, this is not a footnote that you would find in Gramsci's notebook. So think it through. Think it through. How, as you are reading this important stuff about Gramsci on the subaltern, what you're looking at is a completely mangled, destroyed, and in fact turned around stuff where the subaltern is given over to the ruling classes. And that's where you're beginning, and that's your methodological criteria. It's an absolute scandal. Next page. So in here, that you see there are the methodic criteria, etc. That is nowhere to be found. So therefore, the idea of how do we understand Gramsci's connection to the subaltern, it is not there. So in fact, in order to think it, one must love Gramsci enough to enter into Italian in some way. It is, I don't think that we can learn all the languages of the world, but to some things we must be so committed that we want to see how, in fact, in that language that Gramsci acceded in that way that I described, pre-phenomenally and in pre-phenomenally and metapsychologically, Gramsci is trying to write about a very major methodological problem for a communist, and that's what we have completely lost in the kind of translation that we are given, where in fact historiography is given to the ruling classes. So therefore, I think, now those are 4, right? So the other one is those 2 pages. So you just want to make the screen black again. And we'll come back to those. So, as I said, Edward Said and Ranajit Guha, indeed all the Indian subalternists, read Gramsci from this English translation. Therefore, Yashadatta Alone was right in suggesting, I'm quoting from memory so I may not be exactly correct, that to be focused on the subaltern is to be focused on class, because that's what we see in this dreadful English translation, and thus move away from the consideration of the situation of the Dalit. Although I do think that even the Dalit movement should consider the effects upon it of upward class mobility, I also do understand that simply to focus on class was to take it away from the real problem. You notice that Gramsci, beginning from slavery, really wanted to find out how one could relate to and relate the subaltern outside of class. I want the Dalit movement to take Gramsci from his jail cell into their arms, give us a critical Gramsci, give us a Gramsci that is not the Gramsci in the current English translation, establish, in other words, a critical intimacy, or not the Gramsci of the extraordinary intellectual agenda that is our subaltern studies. I think, in fact, Gramsci should be recovered through a going toward Italian by the Dalit movement, because that is what has been obscured here, so that Gramsci doesn't look like an enemy. And by the way, the objection that Gramsci was white, which unfortunately Ronald Judy has made, I myself, of course, believe that white is not a color, but a set of attitudes. But at any rate, Gramsci's dad was an Albanian refugee, so think that one through just slightly. But I don't think that's a serious objection. But at any rate, so I want the Dalit movement to take Gramsci from his jail cell into their critical embrace and give us a Gramsci that is not the Gramsci in the current English translation, or the Gramsci of the extraordinary intellectual agenda that is subaltern studies. Gramsci is very close to death here. This is 1934, and he's really in bad shape. I mean, that wonderful head, but his body is just gone to pieces. The entire notebook 25 is now being translated by Joseph Buttigieg, but he has done the first 8, I think, but he's just decided, because he feels, as I do, that notebook 25 should exist in English translation, the whole thing. But remember, even that translation needs to be checked. And don't tell me you don't have the time to touch Gramsci's plans for an active future that could not be fulfilled because death claimed him. Incidentally, it was really also rather peculiar that in the very powerful essay, in the very first volume of Subaltern Studies, Ranajit Guha did not mention caste at all. I'm sure he had his reasons, and I will ask him when I see him next, but I remain puzzled. In closing, I want to touch on the decolonization of the mind, a phrase learned from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the argument as unusual and brave in 1981, which is when I read it, as it is today. Ngugi's general point, which I cite from memory, and therefore perhaps incorrectly, was, and really Ngugi just kind of tell me I'm wrong, was that African first languages were not just private languages. The imperial languages and African lingua francas should continue to be used for general administrative and political purposes, but the first languages should be acknowledged as public by way of the public practice of shared theater and finally novels. Bilingual in Gikuyu and English, he, quote, translated the texts to instruct a wider and different audience into flexing the imagination. I say this last thing because I teach his stuff and I find these signals embedded in the English translation as I teach his texts, you know, like the number of the name of Matigari, so that we know that that's in the plural and so on. I mean, you move and see that something is happening. So I say this last thing because I find these signals embedded in the English translation as I teach his texts. In our time, in post-colonial countries, decolonizing the mind in translation practices has mostly not yet been activated or achieved. We tend to translate from translations into imperial languages. I believe my old friend Akbar Abbas has a theory that since post-colonials would otherwise read the text from the imperial language, which they would understand at best imperfectly, it is not illogical in the post-colonial situation to translate texts translated into the imperial language, into the local language, from that imperial language translation, rather than from the original. I think this is an absolute failure of decolonizing the mind. I think such theories accept the past of colonization not as changeful history, but as unchanging inevitability. And so I want this to be my last move. I know that we must not translate from English or Senegal from French and so on. I know that we must not translate from English translations and thus forget the most important task of the translator toward the original, to be haunted by its ghost, to imagine it as first language, to be forgiven for the death of its phonic substance, its sound body, allow its ghost to flourish. Now, some people can, you know, when Longinus, of course, Longinus was not a person. It was a collection of people, but let's just call him Longinus for the moment. When Longinus was writing on the Sublime, he did say that some people had the gift to achieve the Sublime. But for those of us who do not have that gift, when we want to achieve that Sublime, we should write as if we are writing for the glorious dead. In the same way, some people have the gift to slip through cracks in language. Mao read Hegel in Chinese mostly, and in fact also read Lenin in Chinese mostly. But in his extraordinary pieces, I've been learning Chinese now for 7 years, I don't know Chinese at all well, but I have come to a place where, helped by graduate students in the East Asian Languages and Culture Department, who are my students in the seminars, working at the Chinese text of Mao with them, I'm able to catch things that sometimes they can't. And it is absolutely amazing how, in his essays like On Contradiction, etc., he is actually able, without saying anything, because he's not going to be disrespectful of Lenin, but very quietly and very tactfully, he corrects Lenin. So some people can, like Longinus's idea of the people being able to achieve the sublime, some people can. But we cannot say that because they could, we will not learn any languages. We who cannot have to, in fact, do it the other way. You know, it's like that idiotic thing, I eat beef because Vivekananda ate beef. Okay, he did other things. How about those? Of course, I don't even want to say it anymore these days because beef eating has become such a stupid thing, but, you know, such a move towards theocracy. But on the other hand, you know, this is what I'm saying. We cannot just simply talk about the people who can get around these problems, but nonetheless, but we have to try it the hard way. So I know that we must not translate from English translations or Senegal from French and so on, and thus forget the most important task of the translator toward the original, to be haunted by its ghost, to imagine it as first language, learned pre-phenomenally, to be forgiven for the death of its phonic substance, its sound body, allow its ghost to flourish. Here, of course, these days all elite universities have language departments. When I was going to school, Presidency College, there were no language departments. So it is possible, in fact, if you really want to step forward and find some way. In globality, there are 1 million ways of deep learning languages. If you don't have the money, not in this room actually, I'm addressing the wrong people, but I do often speak to people who don't have enough money. So if you don't have the money to do it at French and German institutes in your capital city, find it somewhere. I'm now so old that I can say that I was doing without, I used to keep these things a little bit quiet. I mean, I was doing 5 tuitions when I entered the Centre Culturel of the Alliance Française in Calcutta in 1960 to learn French and make a move toward cosmopolitanism. It's possible to find it. I'm talking about the person who loves the text enough to want to translate it. Not every student or reader, he or she goes toward the original, which is the only key to the social formations within the space where the texts were produced. This last bit is taken from my lecture at Jamia Millia yesterday, addressed to a particular friend who would like to translate Mahashita Devi into Arabic, and therefore I'm urging him to want to enter Bengali and be haunted by its ghost. For translation's first contribution is to kill the phonic and phonetic, and therefore sociocultural existence of the text. We walk under the shadow of that loss. In order to push my Syrian friend into it, I declaimed some very well-known lines and their excellent translation yesterday, and I think I will do it again. If you were there yesterday, just bear with it, because that stuff is certainly worth repeating. So, here goes. Now I want the last thing. Here is the opening of a very famous poem. It's like a tag. I don't show some great genius in remembering these lines or anything. These lines are known by most educated Bengalis of my generation. Here is the opening. This is not it. Here is the opening of a very famous poem. The great poet Shankha Ghosh and I are putting out together in a series. This is the first thing that is going to be in the series, a critical edition of Bengali texts on the model of the Loeb Classical Library of European Antiquity that has lasted 150 years. This is the model. This is, you see, it's Book 8 of Plato's Republic. It's a section on democracy. There's the Greek, there's the English, there are notes and critical introduction, etc. It's not just for experts. Obviously, they wouldn't need the English. It's for educated people who want to look at the original, and quite often, some are moved to learn the original, and we are hoping that it will move people toward Bengali. We'll see. But nonetheless, Shankha and I have already got 40 titles, and in fact, on the 17th, I think we were able to get from a wonderful Bengali woman some money. So who knows? It's going to come soon. He's 85 and I'm 76. Better do it soon. Otherwise, it's not going to see the light of day. So this is the model, okay? And so the beginning of Meghnad Kapo, everybody knows. I mean, not everybody, sorry. But older Bengali people, if they're in the audience, they know. Shammukha Shamare Pori, Bir Chudamani Bir Bahu, Choli Jabe Gala Jampure Akale, Kaho Hedevi, Amrito Hashini, Kon Virobare Bori, Shenapati Pade, Pathaila Rane Puno, Rakhokuloniti, Raghavari. That's the first long, wonderful line that I hope some people in the room know. Okay, here is the extraordinary translation by Clinton Seeley, Euro-American, who has loved Bengali well enough to be able to tackle this difficult task, and in spite of the magnificence of his literalist translation, echoing or attempting to echo as much as possible the grandeur of the Bengalis, especially the fantastic proper names, you will hear the corpse of the original sending out its ghost on the translation. When in face-to-face combat, Veerabahu, and of course he's obliged to use the Sanskrit orthography, whereas we say Veerabahu, right? When in face-to-face combat, Veerabahu, crown gem of warriors, fell and went before his time, Akali, fell and went before his time to Yama's city. Speak, O goddess of ambrosial speech, Kahohe Devi, Amritavashini, O goddess of ambrosial speech, which best of warriors, Kon Biro Bariburi, which best of warriors did the foe of Raghava, Raghavari, treasure trove among that clan of Rakshasas, designate commander, then send fresh to the battle. This is why, this fantastic translation of a very long poem by a Euro-American who loved the language, this is why the translator must inhabit the original, taking the idea of the right to an original beyond positive law. I summarize then. Where translation is necessary, we are produced. Where translation is impossible, we surrender actively to the impossibility to make our practice stronger. Where translation is a task, we forget the first two and hunker down to be as responsible to the original as possible. In this translating, we must not translate from the imperial language translations of other texts. I speak to the many translators present in the audience. Don't let English help you avoid intellectual labor, learning to love the language of the underived original. Necessary and impossible, claim it as a task. Get yourself invited to an adventure. So to an extent, I hope what I have given here is exactly the way in which I see the necessity and the impossibility and the question mark. And it's not necessary yet impossible. It's necessary and impossible. Necessary because we cannot be produced as phenomenal creatures without some kind of inaccessible originary imagining, which then, by a kind of programmed mistake, we translate into our real, leaving enough space so that the dog goes meow and the cat woof woof, leaving enough space so that there can be objectification, verification, so that the law can be changed, so that there can be room for the changefulness that is history. So therefore, the whole meaning and language that's a kind of existentially impoverished identification of meaning and language. In this room, for example, because of the presence of that difference, most of you are listening to another speech from the one I'm giving in different ways. So that reality is caught in that idea of a normative deviation which produces as the first declarative about the real something which leaves enough room for the history of meaning and reading to go forward. That's the necessity, right? And then the impossibility is at the same time. The impossibility is what I was telling Naveen, that you don't, and this is a real critique of, for example, the people in my wonderful classrooms at Columbia, global classrooms, who all want to help the world all over the place, mostly with interpreters. And don't snigger, because you folks also tell me again and again in long emails how wonderfully you're helping this, that, and doing schools and so on and so forth. This particular thing also has to be taken down a little bit, because the idea, and this taking down produces a stronger practice, the idea that you can help just anyone, it's the kind of idea that does not for a moment take into question the fact that I myself as an investigator have to change in order to be able to access others who do not resemble me. And here, quantity and quality cannot be mistakenly put together. We cannot, in fact, save the whole world. We may think so, because the digital also saves intellectual labor. So that's the impossibility. I cannot touch the people in those schools with whom I have lived for 30 years, because I still don't know what word or words move them in order to get toward that slant from the straight. I have to be in the straight a little bit because I'm trying to change the reflexive habits of little children into the intuitions of democracy. So that's the impossibility of going toward. In fact, that kind of impossibility is best staged in a one-shot deal, a darkened amphitheater, one lecture. That is, in fact, one of the best stagings of that impossibility, and yet one must try. And yet, the necessity and the impossibility exist together. The middle word is not a yet. When we come into the task situation, we do what we always do, which is we take the double bind. It is necessary, we were produced this way. It is necessary now, every minute. On the other hand, it is also impossible because it involves constantly learning from mistakes and flexing your imagination, going toward the other rather than quickly deciding you can help because you are you. This double bind, because this is the way to go forward, you undermine it. You make it into a single bind. You decide that you will claim the authority of a task threatened by the fact that it is also impossible, so that you can learn from your mistake. And that's where I showed you an example, and believe me, you can find many examples like that, where English has destroyed, not just English, Bengali too, has destroyed the texture of a text, because there hasn't been enough flexing of the imagination toward the original. So that was my example, and then finally I tried to emphasize the fact that we should not, therefore, and for other colonial reasons, we should decolonize the imagination enough to be able to love a language which is not our own, as if it were, and go forward into tasks of translating. We cannot translate all the texts in the world. And yesterday at Jamia, I did read some absurd digital translation, self-praising, name-dropping, interpreting for heads of states, maybe 15 of them together, and the World Economic Forum, and so on and so forth. I will save you those tremendously comical, but on the other hand, very powerful over us, interpreting supposedly for the policymakers. I'm not going to read those. I showed you, rather, something that you want to trust, the English translation of Gramsci, to show you how Gramsci has been betrayed. So that's about it, and I gave you the last, at the end I gave you a summary, which I have now tried to broaden out a little. I want very much some questions, which I suppose I will answer the best I can, because questions for me are the most instructive, so that I can know what mistakes I made, so that I can do better next time. Thank you.
Professor Spivak, just for clarification, one clarification and the other kind of question that I think this audience also would like to hear. One is you move from saying that we must love a language as our first to the later part of your talk where you moved into learning to love. And I was wondering if you want to elaborate perhaps on the relationship between loving and translating for us. And secondly, I wanted to know if you wanted to say something about the other kind of translation that you write about, which is the translation of desire into self-interest by international civil society and NGOs. And I was wondering, is there something to be said about, say, sexual difference and its translation and language and feminism?
Okay, now the second part, the other kind of translation, I was not quite sure what you were describing. Could you just briefly say it again?
Towards the end of the talk and yesterday at Jamia, you spoke about these international civil society, international public policy places where people are translating. And I'm thinking about that other kind of translation that international civil society does, which is the translation of the very important ethical work of the rearrangement of desire into simply self-interest and teaching people self-interest.
Into what?
Self-interest.
Self-interest.
Right? And teaching women self-interest as the intuition into democracy. And I was wondering, how does one check that other kind of translation, and what apart from love can hold one to the work of feminism, especially when one is working with other women or other people's children, as you call them?
Okay, that's a very fine question, very difficult. I'll do what I can with it. I won't really give you an answer, but share the problem with you. What about the next one? There was a hand right behind, yes. You have a mic?
Yes. Thank you for taking my question.
Are you Nishtha? No.
No,
No. Tell me your name.
my name is Shauna Singh Baldwin.
Okay, carry on.
Could you comment on the difficulty of degendering gendered languages such as French, such as Hindi, And do you believe in creating something beautiful in the target language when you translate?
Tell me who you are.
Hello ma'am, my name is Ankur. Recently at the JLF, so there was this talk by Hobi K. Bhabha, and he was talking about Goethe's idea of translation. So in response to my question, he said that democratization of translation is more important than the essence, than the fact that it produces a lot of erroneous translation. So in your opinion, how dangerous or how fruitful is that?
Okay, now, loving and learning to love. I think love is a dirty word, frankly. I mean, I use it, but then, you see, remember, I'm from the 60s, love is just a 4-letter word, and as a lifelong feminist, it's very hard for me to really think of love as any kind of a word. I mean, there were some people, seminarians, who thought that whatever I wrote really echoed with the Christian idea of love. And so all these seminarians kind of came and did a conference and published a book called Planetary Loves, which is supposed to be about my work. And I kept telling them, I don't believe in anything. I mean, I don't even believe in the soul. I mean, please keep this in mind, etc. I don't know why I use the word love, frankly. I think I use the word, I don't know, I'm rationalizing. Because what other word would one use? It's an unreasonable kind of thing. It's an obsessive kind of thing. I'm against the introduction of the state into your private life through the institution of marriage, and yet I've married 3 times. So this kind of difference between what you think is correct and what you do is to an extent reflected in my use of that word love. I think I also use it, again I'm rationalizing, because the idea of the ethical as ahoituki prem, that's also hanging around somewhere. So therefore, take that word love as a very dangerous kind of word, okay? And the thing is also that love is a word which can introduce the incalculable if you really think of love in an existentially thick way where violence can be desired. So this is a kind of a strange word. So that's why I had said one should be able to love the language. Learning to love is a different kind of a thing. The learning to love is part of that epistemological performance. So that, I can say this in terms of Chinese, there was no particular reason that I went taught Chinese. I don't have any sort of, I don't have it taught India, so I suppose I don't have it taught China. I don't have it taught any kind of named collection of people. I don't have any sort of insane admiration or ideal picture of China or anything. But in order to be able to go into a language which does not resemble mine in any way at all, the way in which slowly I have to imagine Han Chinese as a way of going into the ethical semiosis. That is learning. Now we are doing something in Yunnan in April. And of course, Yunnan has these many other languages which are allowed some play by the One Belt, One Road stuff in China now. So to an extent, I'm moving into that to see how that this is really learning. After all, I'm a professor, I'm an academic intellectual, if you want to call me an intellectual, but hey, what? 76 years old, you can call me anything. But so, therefore, that learning, I take that very seriously, because sometimes it's not possible just to do it in a touchy-feely way. And so I do want to tell you that love is a hard word for me, and yet I use it. And now, how does one check the way in which people teach the very poor self-interest? I don't think we should think that we can check it. That is kind of we talk big, sort of preaching to the choir and kind of make web pages and so on, become celebrities. But in fact, the policymakers don't pay any attention to us at all. So therefore, I would say that we shouldn't really think about how can we check it, but look close at small things that we can do, which is why this idea of teaching the intuitions of democracy, the contradiction within democracy, and the absence in human rights work of actually pulling those who are being helped into a development of the subjectship of rights so that it can be the real, the progressive bourgeoisie. They can be morally outraged against their own interests and do human interest. But on the other hand, when you give justified through public litigation, public interest litigation, where I actually do participate. I'm not against it, as I was trying to tell you. When you act, you go against some of your theoretical problems, and it's not, your theoretical understanding is normed by your action. So don't take me wrong, I'm not telling you what to do. But nonetheless, it seems to me that you go small and see if you can make changes through this kind of revolution in consciousness, that sort of effort, in, I don't know, one person, which will lead to 100, one hopes, rather than think, how can one change international civil society and policymakers so that the very poor are not trained into self-interest? Why should they not be trained into self-interest? I'm quite interested in myself. Self-interest is, unfortunately, a very common human attribute. It's just that we shouldn't think about enlightened self-interest as the way to the ethical. That's a tremendous mistake. But so that's how I would say, try small, so that you can do something and go forward. So as for the second one, the difficulty of degendering, I'm not sure that we need to look at gendered languages as somehow expressing or reflecting a gendered mindset. I think that's a mistake. I think as a language person myself, I will not believe that the very complicated and difficult gender systems in languages is a one-on-one reflection. I mean, after all, in French, as you know, you were mentioning French, in la police, I mean, the police is feminine. So, I mean, if you are going to look into these kinds of expressive connections, I think that's useless. In your practice, you must not allow men to come first and men to represent the entire world. About that, I'm absolutely sure. But I also know that people who are tremendously gendered in the wrong way have learned to do this. So therefore, just because they know how to say she and he, or she or he, for that matter, that does not mean that in fact in their practice, it's not so easy. It's a very complicated, it's even more complicated than aesthetics and politics. Because sometimes in fact you can see that a person who is really trying very hard to be understanding of the imagination of equality is in fact using language badly. And so the point is not to correct language practice. So I myself am not really interested in de-gendering, because I also ask myself, who am I to de-gender? How is it that I would be able to de-gender an entire language? On the other hand, you know, Bengali supposedly doesn't have too much of a gender, and if you tell me that that reflects a degendered society, I would say go and boil your head. So, because that language I do know well. So therefore, and the fact of having goddesses doesn't mean a damn thing either. So therefore, it seems, so therefore, it seems to me, I mean, I am from a Shakta family, so therefore, when I say this, I know what I'm talking about. So therefore, I would say that let's not, just as I said to my friend with the question about international civil society, I don't think we should take upon ourselves these tremendous tasks, because I think we should look at our immediate surroundings and know that, and find out how difficult it is, and know that one-on-one also means collective, rather than just remain focused on one person. That is so much harder than these ideas that one is actually achieving something by degendering a language. It won't stay there. Language has its own way of going in any possible direction. It won't remain under your control. Language police is a very bad thing. You know, I have something to do with the word deconstruction, right? So, I mean, it's introduction into the English language. But most people now use it as a sexy word for analysis, breaking up. So that you will hear deconstruction and reconstruction. They forget that there's the word con in the middle, there was destruction, con was put in middle, so construction is implicit in it, tarara. They've forgotten that. That's all right. It's also the name of a certain kind of skirt hem, deconstructed skirt hem. I don't mind at all. It's wonderful that the word should take on, in terms of social production, a life of its own, and mean something that is, you know, if I were a language police person, wrong. You know, it doesn't matter. Language will go any old way. So therefore, I mean, being someone who learned English as a foreign language, a split infinitive shocks me. But you know, native language speakers are splitting their infinitives right and left. So language will go where it goes. So therefore, I mean, when I'm in a classroom, unfortunately, I'm obliged to correct. That's my role. Knowing that this will not have any effect in the grand progress of languages every which way. So I'm not into degendering or anything of that sort, but in actual practice, I'm very careful, as anyone who went to Jamia yesterday would know, that I was quite rude, in fact, in terms of male behavior, and since I was sitting there a female, I was quite rude, but that's a very different thing from taking upon oneself the task of abstract degendering. As for creating something beautiful, no. I don't feel I'm creating anything when I'm translating. I feel when I'm translating that, I mean, this is not how everybody needs to translate. You know, I'm not suggesting this is the only way to translate, but I feel when I'm translating that I must resist myself as much as possible. I must suspend myself as much as possible. I must efface myself as much as possible. I don't even know what beauty is, frankly. I mean, what would be a beautiful text? It sounds terrible. What is? I don't know the answer to that question. Okay, the next one. How can I answer this question? It's about something someone else said. As to, your account of what that person said, you might be wrong. So I think for this, we would really have to have texts. Goethe's idea of translation. I did not read Goethe yesterday, and you know, I'm a very careful teacher. I cannot make a digest. Did you see that twice I said I'm quoting out of memory, and therefore I may be incorrect? See, because I'm writing here like Auerbach in Turkey. So therefore, I was writing last night, when I get close to a group, that's when my juices start to flow. So therefore, I didn't have these texts to check. So therefore, I think your question, democratization of translation, is more important than whatever it was this person said. I really don't know what democratization of translation is. If you mean so that everyone should understand it, I think your idea of everyone is very different from the world's idea of everyone. You know what I mean? So I think it's better to be faithful as much as you can. Go out and touch as much as you can. Go out and learn to love as much as you can, with all of the provisions about that word. The language that is playing out on the page. This is what Benveniste thinks is transcendental. The possibility of differences among and within words to articulate meaning. I think it's best to stay close to that rather than think, I better make this message of Goethe's understandable to everyone. Who are you to think everyone? The world is a very large place. You know, after all, I'm coming from those schools where the word secularism doesn't mean anything. The word post-colonial doesn't mean anything. Even the word translation doesn't mean anything. The word synonym doesn't mean anything. The word necessary, I'm talking about the English words, the word necessary doesn't mean anything. Are they not part of your everyone? So I would say that one should forget, and I'm echoing the same thing, forget how much you can do, that you can touch all the precarious lives and all that kind of stuff. Focus and remember that one-on-one must also mean collective, not just, because the other way of class consciousness through vanguardism and taking out a membership and paying dues does not work. Believe me, you can't produce collectivities and masses in that way. Perhaps focused on one issue, yes, but not the impossibility of social justice after we are dead. For that, focus small. Focus small and see if you are really making changes. Check. Let the other person respond. Don't just go. You see, this is why a one-shot deal like this is so bad. I'm talking, you're silent. This is Walter Benjamin's picture of academic, no, sorry, Nietzsche's picture of academic freedom, right? One person talks, everybody else is silent, but also their elbows are moving, at least your elbows are not moving. So get a response from the other side. That's what I would say, not hit high. As for democratizing translations, forget it. Okay, so if there is time, I'll take 3 more. What do you think? Okay, this guy goes first. Do you know what this is called? Bureaucratic egalitarianism. I mean, their questions might be better for all I know. Okay, go. Tell me who you are.
Hello, my name is Andre. I'm a graduate student at Nalanda in Bihar, but it so happens that it's my mid-semester break, so I happen to
go slow.
I happen to have the awesome opportunity to come listen to you speak, and it was a wonderful talk.
You know, I can't understand what you're saying. Go slow.
Okay, I will try to go as slowly as I can.
There we go. That's your first effort to love.
So, My training so far has mainly been in philosophy, so kind of the orientation of my questions are coming from that angle. There were some really interesting elements, particularly in the earlier side of your speech, in regards to how the human consciousness has a pre-linguistic mechanism that enables children to learn language, and how the first language that we learn, the mother tongue, is somehow more dynamically interesting from a pedagogical perspective. Because we learn it
Slow.
we learn it through others. We learn it through our parents, through our peers, and so on. Whereas when we master a third or fourth language and so on, there seems to be a sense of artificiality to it. So I was wondering, when you were discussing the hollowness, the cultural hollowness that the collective consciousness creates when it engages in a language, be it Latin or Italian or whatever else, how does that engage with that phenomenological view of yours when you're discussing class consciousness, right? And how does that class consciousness emerge from that cultural dynamic of that hollowness of a cultural consciousness when applying language relative to its origins? And how that superficiality of learning further languages enables or disables a activist capacity to engage with human rights and so forth.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
Thank you. My question is shorter.
Sorry?
My question is shorter than the first one. I was recently reading a novel by Sinan Antoun.
By who?
Sinan Antoun,
Okay, oh yes.
an Iraqi novelist.
Yes.
And it's entitled The Corpse Washer. And of course I started reading it first in Arabic. And in Arabic it's entitled Wahda Shajarat al-Rumman, or the pomegranate tree alone. So of course I read it first in Arabic. And then
Why is it, of course? Where are you from?
I'm from Syria.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't think you represent the world. Carry on. Okay.
So, although like the text, of course, I started with was in Arabic, then I read it in English because I wrote some paper on this. Though the text, the original text, of course, was not taken completely. The writer.
Your question is not that short. Ask your question.
Okay, my question is like this: the English text actually left some portions of the Arabic text, but the translator actually over here is not any translator, but the writer himself. So, would you comment, please, on the writer as a translator?
Okay, I really think the person sitting there could do it better than I could, because I don't really write novels and so on. But okay, let me hear the third question.
Hi, ma'am. My name is Ashwarya. I just have one little question. How would you translate the word "other" in one of the Indian languages? Because I mean, if I try to translate it in Hindi, it becomes "dusra," and that's another. I mean, it means another. So, I mean, in effect, it just, I mean, I don't get at the meaning.
Okay, so the first question, I would say that I wasn't saying that these babies learn languages from their parents at all. What I was saying was that the parents learn what the baby's language as the baby. I mean, I wasn't really giving my own opinion either. I was kind of digesting Melanie Klein, but as I said, there's a much more complex discussion of that in an essay which you can find in Parallax. So that's what I was saying. And I was also saying, I wasn't saying that it was necessarily pre-linguistic. I was saying that it was meta-psychological, and again, it isn't my theory. As I said, the two people that I cited, I read them as sort of poetic intuitions about the necessity to think an origin from which a real emerges. And so this, it really is not like learning from parents and learning from textbooks, etc. And I was also saying, and I'm very glad you asked this question, because obviously I didn't make myself clear. I was saying that if one decides that mine is spontaneous and others are artificial, then one is in fact making a mistake. So, and then one begins to value just one's own space. What one needs to do is to think that one has a language this way, one is languaged this way, and perhaps one can, remember, I'm very interested in the impossible. Well, it seems to me that the impossible is what makes things possible for us. As long as we know that that thing is not possible, we can move toward it. And I could give practical descriptions of that kind of work, but obviously this is not the moment for doing that. So therefore, what I was saying is that we must be able, and that's why the very first question, learning to love, we must be able to realize, rather than just kind of know, that every language, however foreign to me, has in fact the possibility of being learnt in that way before. It's not just pre-linguistic, because language exists whether the child is speaking a named language or not. It is rather that it's before our proper I emerges that we invent a language, the parents learn it, and that's how it gets inserted into a named language, with a little difference. The child's a blip. So therefore, one is obliged to, if one is a certain kind of person, to think that that other language also can be learnt that way by many children in the world, and to imagine how that would be. So in fact, the opposition between spontaneous learning from parents and artificial learning foreign languages, that one doesn't work for me. In fact, it's exactly, I kind of question that one. So I'm glad for your question, and because it was possible for me to explain myself better. And as for the writer, I think the writer can do anything. And what you have to think about is, why was this part left out? I changed some of the things I quoted from myself today because of the, you know, can I really say what I thought? I thought a Delhi audience. You know, I'm a Calcutta girl. It's very, very different. So therefore, I changed some of the things I wrote because so therefore, I think what you should do is you should, as a reader who's bilingual and you read in both, ask yourself, why were these passages left out? And that would lead you to an understanding of the text, which would be more global, as it were. That's what I would say. Now, show up, let me see your hand. Yes. Now, I don't know, because I remember what I said in my exchange to Naveen, that I don't know what word would allow those many, many people I know I know well in the villages, to think the slant, okay? So I'm in fact completely careful about synonym hunting. I don't think translation is a matter of finding synonyms. I think translation is a matter of the cluster of thinking that goes into a word, which then you see if you can reproduce it within your way of thinking within the other language. Synonym hunting, I think, has done more harm than good. And yesterday, I was giving you an example, which I have given many, many times. The very elite translations into many languages of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, big documents of that sort, constitutions. I mean, I had, there was a time when it was necessary for me to look at the Constitution of Afghanistan, and it was very clear that although the English version constantly asked you to go to the Dari, I sat down with someone and we went through the Dari. It was very clear that there were words in the Dari which really could only only have come as synonymous translations of English, contemporary English words. So I think that the idea of synonyms is a bad idea. And we should really look to see, because you can play with the difference between para and apara, para and apara. And it's very interesting that in more formal texts, apara, in fact, para and apara is almost the same, but apara is more open. But in order to get there, you really have to think the cluster of thoughts. I mean, I'll give you an example. People talk all the time about how everyone in the world now uses cell phones. Now, we ought to look at the word use and not decide that it is identical with itself. I was just discussing this in the villages because they have cell phones. And we're talking about what they do with cell phones and how the word use has to be, although it doesn't require anything, it's one word, but it's the same argument. Use has to be looked at in terms of caste, class, gender, race, placement within the cyber literacy, etc., etc. It's a very complicated word. It may seem simple. So I would say, forget about synonyms. Try to think of the cluster that produces this. Edward used to say, Saeed used to say to me, one mustn't use the word other as a verb. I said, Edward, you can't stop people. What you going to do? I don't use it. Use other as a verb. Or critique as a verb. I said, why? You should ask, said I to him. I'm a very insolent person. I mean, a cat can look at a king. I would say to him what I'm saying to you. He was a very dear friend, wonderful man. I would say, ask why this is now happening, rather than just simply stop them because you don't like that. So that's what I would say. Look at the cluster of thinking that produces this word, and then go look to see if you can reproduce that cluster of thinking in the Hindi without relying too much on that English text, which probably is relying on French and German texts. So, and then moving back around to a misunderstanding of Sanskrit. So you have to be within a whole new thing rather than how do you do it in Hindi. You see what I'm saying? Very, very good question. And I tried to give you a practical translator's advice. And I hope you will take it to heart, okay? All right, so what should we do? Should we do? Yes, come on, I can see you. What's your name?
The mic.
Good.
Yeah, thanks. Should I repeat that? Or
No, you're translating it. Your voice is nice and strong.
Oh, okay.
Into an Indian
So when
language.
a translation to an Indian language happens of a theoretical or critical work, do you think that it is slightly more challenging than translating a creative piece of work? Because sometimes I feel that because certain Indian language departments because there is not enough decolonization in academia, so certain Indian languages have not developed their critical vocabulary to express certain theoretical and critical texts. Do you face that problem ever, and would you like to speak about it?
Are you a teacher or a student?
Student.
Okay, of what?
English.
Yes, and what stage are you at?
I'm in MA first year.
Yes, I believe you said that, but that's a very good practical question. You see, Indian philosophizing is a space where most students of English, since I'm one myself, do not enter. So therefore, the idea that I'm not saying that these philosophizings are wonderful or anything. I'm just trying to talk about this. Most English department students then can have the idea that Indian languages have not developed philosophical vocabularies. So the idea is to actually go into, unfortunately, you have to go into Arabic, into Sanskrit, etc., Urdu, to look into philosophizing of a different sort from the translation into English. And I'll give you an example of Arindam Chakravarti, who is a Oxford PhD. I think he wrote on Frege with Strawson, and then learned Sanskrit well enough that he actually wrote a book in Sanskrit. He was in Tirupati, where of course they speak in Sanskrit because there's no lingua franca for them and they don't know English well enough. I've never been there, but this is Arindam speaking. And you know, we have, after all, a tradition of Nyaya Mimamsa and all kinds of stuff that I don't really know, but Arindam does. And so he spent a whole year there or something, and he felt that he should perhaps give them some idea of what has been happening elsewhere. So he wrote a small book in Sanskrit, which was the history of European philosophy and more or less analytical philosophy. So, which is Nyaya, which is Mimamsa, that kind of stuff. So and don't tell me I'm wrong, because I may be wrong, I'm not trained in philosophy. But it'll only show that you don't know how to be polite to an ignorant person. But, so he said that the philosophers there said, interesting but somewhat crude. Now therefore, and in fact one can see why they would say this, but therefore the idea that there is not enough of a developed vocabulary shows the limits of our ignorance when we are ourselves students only of English. See what I mean? So when I was asked to give a talk in Bengali on deconstruction, Bimal Motilal was then alive. And so I would quite often ask him what would be the appropriate philosophical word. Because I didn't know the philosophical words, because I was only an English MA, English BA.
I'm curious, what did you call it later?
Sorry?
I'm curious, what did you call deconstruction in Bangla?
Abhinirman. But so that's also something that is quite easily available in Bengali, not a problem. So therefore, I think we need to really think through where, we shouldn't consider, and I say this to myself, and I say this to everyone, the limits of our ignorance as descriptive of a general situation. In order to understand philosophical vocabularies within Indian languages, we really have to go somewhere else. So I think translating creative stuff is perhaps a little more complicated. I don't know what is more difficult. I think I've translated actually both fiction and philosophy. I don't know actually, because as I said, when I'm doing the translation, I'm so focused on resisting myself and going into the text that I can't compare. The 3-4 different kinds of things that I've translated. One is 18th century stuff, Ramprasad. Other is Marchetta. Then the third is Aimé Césaire, which is French, diasporic French as it were, not quite diasporic, but taking French over in a certain way. And Derrida, which is also taking French over, it was Algerian after all, in a certain way. I can't compare them in terms of difficulty. So I don't know whether it's...
Yeah, I wasn't really talking about an inherent or essential...
I understood. I don't have a comprehension problem. I knew what you were saying.
Yeah.
That because there isn't a developed vocabulary. That's the thing that I was trying to address. I hope you heard. I'm sorry, the person I stopped. Yes, come on.
Hello. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for this wonderful lecture.
I actually asked someone else, okay? So I stopped him. So hang on for a second. He will speak and then you take the mic and that will be the end of it. Okay. What is your name?
I'm Ajay Kumar from JNU, and I take your advice seriously and do agree with Dale. My question is with the 2 points which you have said, I'm trying to relate these two. One is that translation is impossible, and next to impossible rather. And then one is to inhabit the original. In ethnography, there is a story about turtle and the fish, you must be knowing about that, where the turtle goes to the land and then tells the fish that I'm going to the land, and then the fish asks what it is like, let me know about it. First time, second time, third time he goes there and then he's not able to explain. He says that there is no water, there is no pebbles, there is nothing like this. And then the fish is frustrated and says that tell me what is there other than what is not there. Now in that sense, what is it really next to impossible or just impossible? If he can go to the inhabiting the real world. Thank you.
Okay, that's a good question. And now give the mic to our friend here so she can speak up.
Actually, recently I've come.
Who are you?
My name is Nupur Sethi. I'm doing MPhil in French, and recently I came aware of the idea that in the text Identité culturelle de la traduction, cultural identity of the translation, which has been written by Annie Brisset, in response to André Berman regarding his 3 intentions of that the translator should take into consideration. That is the intention of the author, intention of the text, intention of the reader. What he added into these 3 intentions was the intention of the culture. So my question to you is that while translating the intuitive and theoretical text like that of Derrida, Nietzsche, etc., this intention of the culture plays a major role, or the intention of the text plays a major role?
Wonderful. Okay, let's go to this one first. No, I think it is impossible. And what we do is we do the impossible because that's the only thing there is to be done. That's why, it's a hard thing to understand. But no, it's not almost impossible. It is impossible. As I said, you kill the sound, which is the body of the text, before you actually start to translate. So the real thing to do is to go toward, as I was saying. Now, I don't think there is a fixed original either. I was saying that we need to think that there is an original. That's where the impossibility comes in. So I didn't just say it was impossible. I also said that it was necessary. And I was asking you to think the two together. It's a hard thing to do. And then, the woman in Kerala, whom I visited in in December, she was so taken by Zahira Rahman, who teaches at a small college there. She was so taken by the remark I made at one point that to brush your teeth is a critique of mortality, because you know that you're going to die, but nonetheless you maintain your body. So this is kind of a simple idea of the impossible and the necessary, as it were, together. So I wasn't really saying it was... what you said about tell me what there is rather than what there is not is a wonderful thing, because I cannot tell you what there is. This is the thing that Harish was doing last night when I also criticized him for being a man and correcting my title. You see, I had given as my title, what is it to translate? And he was saying, like, tell me what there is. So he says, the real title should be, what is translation? I mean, when I gave my whole speech. And I said no, because we don't ask that kind of, I've learned not to ask onto a phenomenological question, because that gives you a definition. This is what there is. This is what translation is. And in order to secure the definition, you put many things outside. Whereas we ask the question always of what it is to do something, the practice of something, because the theory itself is a practice, theorizing. Because it's true that every bit of practice norms the theory. And norms is a word that comes from Foucault's teacher Canguilhem, and he took that word as a polemical word. You have to fight the theoretical impulse to establish definitions so that what there is does not get completely cut up because you are talking about what something is. We're not talking about the hard sciences. We're talking about these kinds of existentially thick disciplines. And so he said, so we know that we should be prepared to confront the fact that the practicing of something will be normed by the practice itself, so that these learning from mistakes, history can move on. Foucault changed the word to political, and I think that's much less interesting than Canguilhem's word. So to an extent, this is, I explained yesterday when Harish was taking it over as to what I was really doing was defining translation and why I shouldn't have called it what is it to translate. But that, Ajay, that's what you said your name was? That is what I would say, that yes, it is to an extent necessary and impossible rather than almost impossible. And also because what you do then actually contradicts that. And secondly, that no, we are not particularly interested in talking about what there is, but because what if we define that there is undoubtedly something, but if we define that into what classical definitions are like, we have to cut out a lot of stuff. So that if we actually talk about what it is to do that, even to make definitions, then the idea that practice norms this kind of work becomes more important, and we look forward to future workers in the field rather than say that mine's the best theory. So therefore, that's what I would do. As for my questioner here, you know, I cannot judge intentions, and I'm not interested in judging intentions. I'm more interested in the play of words on the page. And I'll tell you something that's, therefore this particular debate is not for me. What I would say is that today, you know, when I teach at Columbia, what I find is because of the capacity of the digital to save intellectual labor, most of my students don't know how to read. They are incredibly smart people, and you know, small senior seminars, fourth-year students at Columbia, they can summarize, they can talk about the intention of what this person is saying, they can talk about their own intentions, they can give historical clues, they can relate it to other texts, but they cannot pay attention to the language happening on the page, meaning being made on the page. That they cannot do. This is a very difficult thing to teach. And I'll tell you the story of a person. He happened to be the best student in philosophy. He's now graduated. And he could actually give me back my words. He knew my intention well enough. And he could, better than I knew, in class. And then he could, in fact, also give us Heidegger's intentions, or Toni Morrison's intentions from the texts we were reading, and so on. And we even make historical connections. But he knew that he could talk that talk, but he couldn't walk into the text and read it. And this happened day after day. And then on the last day, he's weeping in my room. It's a nice white guy, the male, the best student in philosophy. He's weeping. And I told him, look, I can't help you. I'm not your mother or your sheikh. I'm glad that you have developed some rage against a system that will reward you as the best student, but that has not taught you how to read. It's that intention mapping and making it happen like that. So, that translation is like that. If you sat down and knowledge managed a translation job like that, nothing would come out. It would perhaps come out in a very artificial way. So I would say that, and I told him that you will also forget this, because once you graduate from a brand name university, best in philosophy, people will give you jobs, you will do well. You will forget that there was that little class where day after day, the task of reading escaped you because you had been taught how to control a text, how to know a text, how to see the text as a target, and so on. So therefore, what I've been trying to say today is the fragility of the act of translating. That's a different way of thinking of this intention, this intention, this intention, and this intention. I can't do that because, so therefore, this particular debate is not one that I can relate to. I wish there were time for you and me to sit down together, because you're a first-year graduate student, right? Is that true?
No. I'm doing my MPhil.
You're doing your MPhil. So you're like third year? I don't really know about MPhil.
First year.
Huh?
First year, I'm doing my coursework right now.
Yes, but MA is first year, isn't it? I know it's after the MA. So she's not a first-year graduate student. Okay, because she had to do the MA before. Why are you answering for her? So the thing is, she should be able to tell me. MPhil doesn't mean anything to me. So you went into an MA first, right?
Yes.
And so you are what, a third-year graduate student? You've been a postgraduate for 3 years?
I've been a postgraduate student.
For 3 years, okay. For 3 years or 2
For 2
years?
years.
2 years, very good. So you're still, 2 years. I wish you and I could sit down together, and then maybe we could look at these debates and so on, and perhaps I could rearrange your desires a bit. Perhaps I wouldn't be able to, but we would see. You're the only one who has really affected me that way in these exchanges. So one of these days, perhaps
Yes, sure.
we'll talk. What is your name again?
Nupur Sethi. Nupur Sethi.
Nupur Sethi. Very good. One of these days, write me an email, and we'll think what to do about this.
Thank you.
No, don't remain there. Okay, thank you.